influencing employees, that is a big, shall I say, hurdle that we constantly have to overcome. So what we can look at is the influence triangle. Okay, so we teach and communicate the hazard identification, risk assessment to all the employees. Oftentimes you'll see that actually fails, because like Sibu mentioned now, if you say risk assessment, everybody's eyes goes like this and it's chaos all around. Okay.
Hello and welcome to My Safety Hub, where we delve into the world of occupational health and safety. Today we're joined by Sbusiso Mnisi from MAKROSAFE and Candice Jansen van Vuuren from SafetyWallet to discuss the importance of hazard identification and risk assessment in the workplace. Hello, Sibu and Candice.
Hi, Oki. Thank you.
Hi, Oki. Thank you for having us here. We're looking forward.
Great stuff. Just to start off with, if you can just give us a bit of background about yourselves before we look at the questions that we would like to discuss today.
I think I'll leave it to the ladies first.
Thank you, Sibs. They say age before beauty. All right, thank you, Oki. I've been with MAKROSAFE for about 6 years, and then recently I moved over to SafetyWallet, performing their audits and risk assessment. So previously with MAKROSAFE, I was a health and safety practitioner, going out, implementing and maintaining health and safety systems at various client premises.
Perfect. And yourself, Sibu?
All right, like Oki said, I'm Sbusiso Mnisi, working for MAKROSAFE. I've been with the company now for the past 17 years. I joined MAKROSAFE 2005, the 5th of September. So far, it's been a great journey for me with MAKROSAFE.
Perfect. Candice, I'm going to start with you. As a health and safety professional, could you explain the importance of hazard identification and risk assessment in the workplace?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so hazard identification and risk assessment plays a crucial part in your safety management. Okay, so hazard identification, what we look at is identifying possible sources of harm that can lead to accidents, incidents in the workplace, injuries, or illnesses. Okay, by identifying these, we do our risk assessment that involves putting a rating or a risk rating to these specific sources of harm. But once we have the risk rating, we can identify, is it a critical hazard, is it a potential, is it a low, and based on that, we can put, as the employer, you can put suitable control measures into place to ensure a safe work environment, and ultimately that also assists with creating a positive health and safety culture at your workplace.
That's a very, very broad answer, and I think it basically boils down to the most important aspect for me, at least, when we consider risk assessment and hazard identification, and you've mentioned it now, in establishing a safe workplace. But in this broad answer that you've given now, I'm taking it that obviously there would need to be a range of processes and tools that you would need to use to identify the hazards and the risks and the control measures necessary for those risks as well. Sibu, can you maybe expand a little bit on that, on the methods that would need to be used or applied in the hazard identification and risk assessment process?
Oh yes, there is a lot of tools that can be used to identify the risk assessment itself. When you conduct the risk assessment, you can you can do the inspection checklist, you can do the safety toolbox talks. There's various ways that can be used to identify the hazards.
Would you say that engaging with the employees themselves that are performing the tasks that you are analyzing is maybe one of the most important aspects in the process?
Most definitely, Ockert, because those people, they are engaged actually with the job on a day-to-day basis. They all knows like the ins and outs, the hazards that are pertaining to that. Therefore, it's very much important that you actually inform them about the hazards that they're exposed to, and they will actually teach you a lot as you're conducting the risk assessment, because they knows the job as they knows themselves, because it's their day-to-day thing that they do. Yes.
Having a set structure for the analysis of risks after you've identified the hazards would naturally also be important. Can you maybe elaborate on call it the methodology, the risk assessment methodology that would need to be used in this process?
Yes, so the risk assessment methodology that you use walks hand in hand with your risk matrix that you're ultimately looking at. So that will state, we at MAKROSAFE, we work on a 5-point basis. So it's either a low probability or low severity that you're working on, looking at things like maybe a headache, eye strain in terms of ergonomics. Or when you move it up a bit, say you have a 3 on your risk matrix with your methodology combined, you would look at first aid treatment, paper cuts, things like that. When you go upper on the scale, when you increase on the scale, what you would look at is fatalities would be a 4. And then ultimately you'd look at a 5, which would be multiple fatalities, like a disastrous event that would take place. And then you'd see what is the probability of that taking place with the current risk that you are working with.
Okay, so having a sound methodology is therefore vital, and making sure that methodology is applied as a standard across the board with every client or every workplace that you engage with would necessarily be very, very important. If we take a step back towards the first instance, which is the identification of the hazard itself, how do you determine which hazards are more dangerous than the next? Sibu.
I would say that, in most cases we rely on the facts and the states of those incidents. If you look at we work closer with workmen's compensation, they'll always release the stats, and then we've got a team as well that looks at that, and then all the stats of the injuries we can actually see the number of the incidents. But however, in most cases, we look at the worst case scenarios when we conduct the risk assessment, that you need to look at your worst case scenarios. What if this happened? This could be the end results. But the correct one to measure it's the number of incidents that were reported pertaining to that particular task. Say, for instance, operating a forklift. If you look at the forklift, it will be always rated as a high risk because of the number of incidents that came out of it. And then if you align it with your hazard identification, it will actually be on top as the high risk.
So that's an interesting approach where you work backwards from incidents and accidents that have been recorded previously,
Yes.
Then looking at the tasks related to those incidents or accidents, then associating or looking at the hazards related to those tasks, and from there to determine what the possible dangers are, therefore the risks involved and the likelihood of those risks coming to fruition. That's a really interesting way of looking at it. What if there are no incident statistics available to work with? What would you do in a case such as that, Candice?
Okay, so with no incident statistics that are available, you would do, again, your hazard inspection, have a look at the task that is being done. You can do a job safety observation, break that task into smaller tasks, okay, of that specific activity that you are looking at, and then associate the possible risks that can go with conducting that activity.
Okay, so it's almost like asking impossible questions to get to impossible answers, because you don't know whether it's really going to happen, and therefore the word risk remains, relevant.
I would agree. Sorry, okay. I would agree with Candice there because not having the incident or the accidents doesn't necessarily mean that we won't have one. The possibilities of it to happen, it's still there. So therefore, it's actually better to keep more more control. You controlling it, just to make sure that even if there's something that is happening, it won't be as ridiculous as when there is no control measures available in place.
That's a good point, and I think it's an interesting one to maybe discuss a little bit further, because if you consider non-compliance and if you consider ignorance, people just being ignorant towards the risk assessment process, or maybe having a way of thinking about health and safety and saying that it's never happened to me, therefore I'm not going to pay attention to it, or it's never happened in my workplace, so why do I need to conduct a task-based risk assessment? What you're saying is that even though the event hasn't taken place yet, there's always the possibility that it would happen.
Yes.
So it relates back to the near misses, which eventually quantifies up into the incident itself and where there's harm.
That's
or loss.
100%. I think it's like breaking records, in life. If actually there is a record that is currently standing, that means it's humanly possible. Then there can be someone that can still come and break that record. So same with the incident. even if it hasn't actually taken place to your premises, somewhere, somehow, it actually, maybe in some places, it has already happened and it's humanly possible. So, therefore, it's better to prevent it more so that when it actually happens, probably the risk will be a bit lesser than when there is no prevention.
So being proactive in this regard is obviously more beneficial,
That's correct.
even if you don't necessarily see the benefits immediately.
Yes.
Or even if you probably don't see the benefits ever. If you manage the risk accordingly with the necessary control measures from the hazards that you've identified, you probably will never see the benefit, because if you do it properly, the incident's not going to happen.
Yes.
And I think that's where persons become complacent with regards to health and safety in the workplace as well. So I've done the risk assessment, I applied these controls, so we're not going to worry about it. But the review of the risk assessment, the review of the task, the reanalysis of the activities taking place in the workplace, therefore becomes more and more important. So my question in this regard then is for you, Sbu. How would you remain consistent and objective from one workplace to the next, or one area in the workplace which is maybe similar to another area in the workplace with similar tasks or activities? How do you remain consistent and objective from one task to the next task, and to not generalize or create a generic type of risk assessment?
One thing that we need to remember, it can be the similar task that is being done. However, the way of doing it, it won't be exactly the same. That's why it is crucially important to make it a point that it's actually client specific. The client will differ from the client to client. I'll take, for instance, driving of a forklift. One person might actually be having like a lot of work to do with the forklift. Hence, on the other client, the very same forklift that is being used, it's not actually under pressure as the first client. Therefore, you need to bear in mind the speed that that person needs to operate in. You need to look at the premises itself. Probably that other one, it's an open flat surface. The other one, it has got a slope or whatever the case might be. Therefore, you need to look at the premises itself. That's why it has to be client specific rather than generalize it. Yes.
I think also maybe being constantly aware of everything that's happening around that task or activity is really, really important. Can you maybe elaborate on how you would naturally try and stay as objective as possible with regards to not to create generic risk assessments? Because if we start getting generic, or if we start generalizing with regards to the assessments themselves, we're actually opening ourselves up for more risk.
Yes. Okay. So what I would say, okay, with your, like Sbu mentioned, the differences in premises, and then you also have the human factor playing a part in that. So the one person might have experience. Again, I'm using the example of driving a forklift. So the one person drove a forklift, like Sbu's been here for 12 years. The other person has been driving it for 3 months. So you also need to take into account that human factor that might have a part to play in terms of that. And then with your one premises, you'd look at implementing barriers, for instance, as a control measure, depending on where they are driving, which won't be applicable to your next premises.
So it brings me to a next question then. How would you go about making sure that you consider all the different various types of hazards that may exist in the workplace? Because you've got ergonomic, you've got chemical, you've got biological. How do you make sure that you don't really miss anything?
Right, so with making sure, you need to do your research on the task. You don't just go out and say, okay, this is what is happening, and you create a risk assessment from there. You discuss or consult with the persons that are actually conducting the tasks and activities. They will be your primary source of information, because for all you know, they've been doing that for years. Okay, they know exactly the hazards and risks associated with that. Then you can also look at your manufacturer's manuals and instructions on how that machine is supposed to operate. Okay, unfortunately, a human flaw, they tend to bypass certain safety on machines to get to an end product. Okay, so if they remove guards, anything that you might not know is needed there, The instruction manual will give you more information on that. Then a job safety observation, a very powerful tool that you can use on all of this. You can always refer to job safety observations. Again, previous incidents that you have a look at. And for chemicals, we'll look at material safety data sheets. That is all the information on the chemicals, perhaps a chemical survey that would be needed to be done at that premises.
I think it's probably a danger that a lot of employers face, and I'm speaking hypothetically now, that the risk assessment process becomes a documentation exercise where the document ends up in a file that lands on a shelf and it never gets looked at again. And I think, again, the review of whatever we've analyzed before becomes more and more important as time goes by, because situations change. You've just mentioned changes in the work environment from using the same type of machine, a forklift in this case. But I think also being observant with regards to not only the individuals as they're performing the task with a job safety observation, but also I think asking the right questions to the right people.
Yes.
You've spoken about the employees performing the tasks themselves, but there are other role players that also I think need to be engaged with. You've got the Health and Safety Committee. There may be persons in HR that you maybe need to consult with, because if you're looking for incident records that have been reported to workmen's compensation, you will need to look at those records as well, related to those tasks and activities. So it's really a very wide scope of information that you need to consider. And it cannot simply just be a box ticking exercise.
I think it starts by simplifying the risk assessment itself, because to some people, once you say risk assessment, they're looking at this huge mountain to climb, that it's what is risk assessment and whatnot. But if you come to think that I've got my own way of simplifying risk assessment, I say it's a day-to-day exercise that you do. I will even ask maybe the class, if, like, say for instance, I do conduct the training, and ask the class that, how many of you actually are driving cars? Then they'll raise their hands, and then I said, did you drove this morning? Have you drove this morning? Yes, I drove. I came to work with my car. I said, you know how many times have you done risk assessment unaware? Because if there's a red robot, you stop there, you check if it's safer for you to proceed, then you proceed with your journey. However, while you're doing that, you're not just assessing you're not just assessing yourself, you're assessing the other drivers as well. So it all starts by simplifying it, and then whenever you engage these people, they will be like easily approachable and give you the answers whenever you start actually engaging them into the answers, into the questions according to the machines that they're using. Yes.
So that brings me to the way of thinking about
Yes.
what we do, right?
Correct.
I mean, you mentioned it now. We actually analyze risk every day, all the time.
Yes.
When I invited you to come to the interview, I believe that you guys must have done massive risk assessments and asking yourselves, well, should we do this or shouldn't we do this? But it's the truth. When you cook something on a gas stove, you do a risk assessment. When you decide to turn your back on that stove and to pay attention to something else, you're taking a risk. So you're making an informed decision, or you're taking a chance as to the possible hazards that's already existing there. If you do that repeatedly, your way of thinking with regards to the danger that exists is probably negligible. So, how do you influence the employees that you're working with in making the hazard identification and risk assessment process continually part of the health and safety culture of the organization? Candice.
Okay, so influencing employees, that is a big, shall I say, hurdle that we constantly have to overcome. So what we can look at is the influence triangle. Okay, so we teach and communicate the hazard identification, risk assessment to all the employees. Oftentimes you'll see that actually fails, because like Sibu mentioned now, if you say risk assessment, everybody's eyes goes like this and it's chaos all around. Okay, then we would actually listen to them, listen and learn from them. What are they looking at? How do they perceive the hazards and risks around them, or the world around them? Okay, again, simplifying it by saying, okay, you're driving to work. That already gives you more of an idea of how the risk assessment is done, right? And then after that, you would influence them. If you're not able to influence the person directly, what you will look at is maybe speaking to a supervisor, a manager, even the CEO, right? Because the best option is working from top to bottom. The CEO is ultimately liable, so he needs to make sure he provides a safe and healthy work environment. Speak to the CEO, convert them into a positive health and safety culture, and then it flows through the organization, hopefully.
Hopefully.
I think, Candy, just to add on what you say now, it's more actually of even try to make it fun. Because something that is too serious, I don't think that people are taking it serious. They will be actually scared instead of like recognizing it. I always make an example of the Ockert chart that is on the wall. The small faint that is there, the summary of the act. Nobody has time to go and read it. I remember I once actually teased one of the group that I had in one of the class. I said, if this chart had like pictures, maybe of any scary things or any fun things, how many of you could have like went and read there? They said definitely we could have like gone and read it. That's why I even like try maybe to simplify it, have it in a format whereby it can be communicated to them. The more you make it fun, it's the more people they will remember it. They will actually make it like as a game, that you remember the game that you played on the risk assessment, but they will always remember that. But if it's something that is intense, something that is very serious, people, they will start to be like scared of it, and then they will try to avoid it. But if you make it fun, it's always easy.
I think if I listen to both answers, I think it's all about understanding the specific workplace's needs and the people that work inside of it.
That's correct.
Because maybe the fun approach wouldn't be suitable for everybody.
Exactly.
Maybe the serious approach would be better suited for other individuals in other workplaces. But I think it comes down to being able to coach and work with those individuals effectively.
Yes.
And effective communication, like you've mentioned, the influence triangle or pyramid as it's called, which is effectively a communication tool, then becomes vital. But I think you also have to be kind of light-footed to be able to react to the different scenarios as it takes place and to understand the individuals that you're working with better, which is also contained in the influence pyramid as well, is getting to understand, getting to know the people that you're working with. Because as soon as we start scrumming into a direction which isn't something that suits the individuals that you're trying to work with or influence, be it the health and safety committee or the person's actually performing the work, you start losing trust, you start losing credibility, and eventually the entire process starts becoming an island from the rest of the organization. And you can do your utmost best. People are not going to take it seriously. Whether you take a light-hearted approach or a more serious approach to the importance of a risk assessment itself. Can you possibly share an example of where you were able to successfully identify hazards and risks, maybe related to incidents that were taking place in a workplace, and how you reduced those number of incidents, or how you managed to control those hazards and risks effectively?
Okay, there is a lot of cases like that, okay, but I'll specifically use this one for one of the clients that I implemented. It was for paper cards. Remember, when we do the inspections, when we implement the system, we go as far as looking at the first aid cases, those minor incidents, because remember, out of the minor incidents, a certain number of near misses and the minor injuries, they can be like a serious injury or a serious incident or even a permanent disability or even death. So looking at that client first aid box, always you'll find out that the plasters are being used. But when you look at the recordings, it's always the paper cut, until to such an extent that we looked at the root cause analysis of it and found out that it's the type of paper that they were using. Then they had to actually change the type of paper that they were using to a certain brand of a paper that they were using. Since then, there was no incident when it comes to the paper cut. So minor things that we take lightly on a day-to-day basis, but it can actually make a huge improvement. So it's like the results that you were talking about. People, they always look at those results, that what are the end results, what is it that we're getting. By doing all these, you have the healthy employees that are always at work. That's a bonus, that you're actually gaining something out of that. You have no incidents that are reported. That's a bonus, you get something out of it. So out of these, it's just that people, they're expecting to see the bigger things, that what is actually the final end results out of what they're doing.
I think that's a really interesting example. If you consider risk, we talk about incidents at work, we always think it's a forklift that maybe crushed a person,
Yes.
or something that fell off a shelf that fell onto somebody's head, or a building that collapses. It's a really small activity.
Yes.
It's a really small task. I mean, it's an administrative duty that maybe somebody or a lady in an office is performing.
Yes.
But there's an issue.
There is an issue, because remember, okay, if this person, say for instance, he had that paper cut, he goes home, maybe uses the sunlight or whatever the case might be, whatever chemical that he can use, only to find out that the wound is getting septic. When times goes on, the doctor said he needs to amputate. But then we don't look at the root cause analysis, that it started with that paper cut that he had at workplace. So now it ended up being for that person to lose part of his finger through the amputation. It's something that could have been avoided by making it a point that we deeply assess it, find the root cause, and then we put the precautionary measures to prevent the recurrence of a similar incident.
And even if it doesn't evolve into a situation as serious as what you've mentioned, possible amputation, at the very least, there's a possible impact on the business itself. There's a possible impact on the person's morale in the company.
Correct.
Because, if you're constantly going to be hurt every day, even if it's something as small as a paper cut, your motivation levels goes out the window. And if we think about the impact in terms of lost time, every time you need to get up and walk to the first aid box to put a plaster on your finger, you could have finished the task. You could have finished something else. You could have finished the spreadsheet. You could have made a phone call or sent an email.
Exactly.
So, those repetitive impacts add up.
Yeah, I would say, because if you look at it, some first aid boxes, you even use the seal to lock them. Every time you go there, you break the seal. There is actually expense involved. There is time involved. There is a lot of things. I always say, I use this example for crime, that if we can actually look at the petty crime, wipe it off, because it's the feeder of the big things. So now, looking at the incidents as well and the accidents, if we actually stabilize the minor ones, make sure that we cut them completely off, then there will be no feeder for the bigger ones. I don't know if can.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Sibs, definitely.
Yeah, so it's actually a way of looking at it. If you take your risk assessment register, you've got a list of all the tasks and the associated level of risks to them. They're high, they're medium, they're low, but they would be ranked from highest to lowest. Everybody always starts at the top, right? So they go to the most dangerous thing, and I understand why that's done. But the question essentially then becomes that if an employer isn't willing to look at the little things and sort them out, how will they effectively change the big things? And again, that goes back to the way of thinking about health and safety in general, which is the culture that we need to develop as well. Another part that I think is really vital is the management system, or health and safety management system of the business as a whole. And the question I have here is, how do you ensure that the hazard identification, risk assessment process, everything that needs to be conducted within it, that it forms part of the health and safety management system of the business, instead of being something that stands completely separate from that system? How do you make sure that it actually starts pulling into one complete system, and that it's actually effective, that it's doing what it's supposed to do?
So your risk assessment, your policies, procedures, everything needs to form part of this bigger picture. Right? In order to do that, we need to get everyone in on it. Okay, you can say buy in or participate in it. Like I mentioned earlier with the influence triangle, it starts from the CEO. If we have a policy in place, it's your scope is aligned with your risk assessment. Everything is aligned with your business, and your CEO signs off on that. You communicate it through to your employees, to your managers, your supervisors. Again, it branches out and it becomes one whole system instead of having the production on one side and health and safety on the other side.
Okay, so if we take the triple P system, which has been discussed in previous interviews, establishing the scope for that system is one process. The risk assessment becomes another process, but they're also integrated then. I mean, if you want to be accurate in the one, you need the other to complement it. The question then is, if we have a policy that governs hazard identification and risk assessment, and if we therefore have a procedure that comes from that policy in how this needs to be done, and if it's not done accurately, does that mean it's a failure in the system?
Yeah, it could be a failure in the system, that your scope and your risk assessment was perhaps misaligned when you didn't discuss it with someone. So always discuss your scope and the risk assessment. Always consult with the supervisor, consult with the CEO. So those are not decisions that you, as a health and safety practitioner or an auditor, would do on your own. Always take into account the other person's perspectives on it as well, to ensure that the procedure and the policy is aligned to actually reach the goal. If it's not, you can always look at reviewing it, because everything is not it's not a one size fits all for each company, so it needs to be tailor-made for that specific premises. If there's a gap in that, it needs to be revised, what went wrong, and it needs to be implemented differently.
And I think just to add on that, Candy, you spoke about the buy-in. The more, because I think from the beginning, when the policy is actually being implemented, that's where the management commit themselves that they'll provide the health, safe working environment to their employees. But then with the employees being part of it as well. So the buy-in for the employees as well, it will be actually easier, because you need to link it. Once that policy is there, it's actually signed that there is a commitment for us all. Remember, for the employees, a minor thing that they're reporting and it's taken serious, it goes a very long way once they actually got their buy-in. Because even I myself, if I will come to you as my superior and then I said, there is a cable that is lying on the floor. Is there a specific reason? Because I see that people will trip and fall out of it. And then nothing gets done about it. It actually frustrates you, because you see that you're not actually being valued on whatever that you say. But if you will have a decency of coming back to me and say, Sbu, that cable, we actually moved it, we made a channel, a proper channel for it, it's no longer on the walkway, it will actually keep me motivated to actually being more observant, not just to look for faults, but to be more observant, think out of the box, not just to focus on what is it that I'm here for, but also to look at other things that has got potential to cause harm and injuries. And then if you link the two, like with the triple P, your policies, procedures, and practices, it's actually becoming easier. And once it becomes easier, then you try to make it a culture. Once it's a cultural thing, remember, once we said culture, it's something that someone is proud. It's something that someone is proud of. I'll make a typical example, like the brides for the whites. It's one of the culture. The Zulus for the dance and whatnot. It's something of a culture. Once you talk of a culture, it's something that someone is proud of. Yeah.
I also think we need to consider how important the risk assessment really is. If we're thinking about systems, the risk assessment becomes the cornerstone of everything else that happens from a health and safety perspective in the business.
Yes.
Everything else. If your risk assessment is done in isolation and it gets shelved, will the control measures really be applied? And even if they are applied, are they being applied the way that they should be applied? So as a prescriptive document, along with the information that is contained in policies and procedures and maybe even practice documents, the risk assessment for me is the catalyst for success in health and safety, if you apply it correctly,
Yes.
if it was done correctly. And if we don't have everything that we discussed before, a correct methodology, a way of measuring risk and quantifying risk, accurately, if we don't engage with management, if we don't engage with the employees performing the tasks, if we don't apply the control measures, learn about them. We spoke about research that needs to be done. And doing that continually, it's just a paper exercise.
Yes.
And you're not going to make any positive impacts out of it.
Definitely, okay. Your risk assessment is supposed to be a working document. To conduct it and put it in a cabinet somewhere and close it off there, it's not going to be working for you, because you need to monitor it on a day-to-day basis, on a regular basis, to ensure that it's actually giving you the expected results. So to conduct it and just keep it aside and then say it's fine, we've got risk assessment, it's not going to work. It's supposed to be a working document that you use on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly, thank you, Sub. So just to give an example of that, when we do an audit, there are multiple questions that we ask in terms of the risk assessment as well. One, is it available? Is there a comprehensive risk assessment with control measures and everything? That's your nice document that you won't shelve. Okay, has it been signed off? So your management and your team needs to sign off on that risk assessment. So again, it acts a lot like the policy to say we are committed to this document by signing it off. And then also we need to look at the communication of the document itself to the employees. Everyone needs to be aware of the hazards and risks associated with their tasks and activities.
But then again, Candy, what actually I like about this new triple P that we currently doing now, if you look at the previous one, some of this management, it was just a matter of signing the risk assessment as a window dressing, that I have it, it's signed. But now we're going deeper, whereby we say, okay, fine, for each and every task, this task needs to be communicated to the employees that are engaged in that particular task. And then all the control measures, we look deeper into it, that is all these control measures that they signed for, that we will put them in place. Are they actually putting in place all those control measures as promised when the document was signed?
Yes.
Then whatever control measure that is not in place, that's why it's crucially important for them to firstly go through the risk assessment, and then if they feel that this part of control measures it's not necessary for us, we don't do it. That's why I can take it back to when Oki was saying it needs to be client specific. So if that control measure is not actually suitable for that particular client, we agreed that no, let's remove this because this is not part of the control measures that we're using. Instead, you can add something that, okay, fine, instead add this one, this is what we do instead of that first control measure that you have in place. But then again, we come and check, are all those control measures that we're mentioning there being put in place? Are they there? And then if one of those control measures are not in place, that's where we actually generate the findings for the clients, for them to be able to see the gap that they're still having that still needs to be covered.
I think risk assessments and hazard identification and everything that goes into it, if we take the conversation today, we're basically only scratching the surface. There's a lot of things that we can really discuss, and we can go into a lot of depth with it. But for today's session, I really want to thank you both for joining us on My Safety Hub. I look forward to hosting you again. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. Please subscribe to the channel if you like this information, and also please leave your comments and questions in the area provided below.